Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event this afternoon on jobs and growth, which is part of a series that we are running on new challenges for development, some of the issues that any attempt to reconfigure the Millennium Development Goals after 2015 would have to confront in terms of the sort of realities of development today. Today we're focusing in on one of them, on jobs and growth. I think there's sort of three currents, in a sense, that have brought us here. One is obviously the huge link between jobs as the sort of missing link, in a sense, between growth and poverty, where growth reduces poverty in any kind of large-scale way. It generally does so through the creation of jobs. When you ask poor people, as, for example, the Gallup World Survey recently did, how they would rank different outcomes, prioritise different possible actions, they always rank creating jobs very highly. And in fact, interestingly, when there was a sort of ranking exercise done on the MDGs, creating jobs for young people came up higher than universal primary education, higher than combating malaria, higher among the whole population, though not among women, than reducing maternal mortality. So it just gives you an idea of the kind of place of jobs and job creation in the kind of world of development as seen by poor people themselves. I think that's the first kind of reason why it's important to talk about these issues and why we're here today. The second thing, closer to home, is that there's a renewed interest in job creation and in jobs among donors, certainly in the recent bilateral aid review, where the Department for International Development has put together the sort of results that they are hoping to achieve across the world over the next period. If you add up the offers from the different countries, it adds up to over 1 million jobs that DFID is hoping to create through DFID programs over the next 5 years or so. So that just gives an indication of the sort of increased interest in those issues among donors. And thirdly, of course, we are starting now, in a slightly nervous way, to see a discussion about what might happen after the MDGs among donors, among civil society, among a whole range of different actors. So, these things which we think are important and yet are sort of insufficiently covered by the current framework and the current ways in which we can think about development and deliver development programs, this is the opportunity to really think about how to incorporate some of these ideas into a new architecture. That's the background, that's why we're here today. We've got a great panel here. On my right is Sarah Cook, who is the director of UNRISD, who recently produced this fine volume, Combating Poverty and Inequality, which has got more in there about employment than most of us will ever know. So we're very, very pleased to have Sarah here. Then on my far left is Professor Naila Kabir, who's a professor of development studies at SOAS and has been working on issues of employment, particularly among women and labour markets, for a very long time. And on my immediate left is Christina Weller, who is a economist working at CAFOG, the Catholic Development Agency, and has just produced an interesting new paper on small enterprises, which obviously are sort of, an important dimension to this, which often is, is not very glamorous and often forgotten in the sort of hurly-burly of the policy debates. So we're looking forward to hearing what all these people have to say. It's a sort of the usual format. Sarah and Naila are going to present first. Tina will share a few thoughts on the presentations. I'm going to be unable to resist adding my my 2 cents as well, and then it will be open for questions. We're going to finish promptly at 2:30. So thank you very much. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. And remind me as time is passing. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present. I was asked to present a little bit based on the report that Claire has mentioned, that was published last year, at the end of last year. But I'm going to focus, it's a long and comprehensive report, and I'm going to focus on a few key messages, particularly, that relate to the links between poverty and employment. I think just briefly I'll cover some of the historical experience on which the report is based. And historical and sort of comparative experience of a number of countries going from over a period of about 40 years. And in particular, I'll try and highlight within that the links between social policies and employment and patterns of growth. And I'll say more about that. And then I think try and think particularly about the policy frameworks and the macro as well as the sort of more meso and micro where employment policy is often located and how important they are for the overall employment situation. And then reflect on potentially some areas that might be useful for thinking about employment generation given the current economic situation. Just briefly on the report and trying to highlight a few key elements of it. I mean, it was designed to look at and it was a long-term research project to look at what accounted really, despite the fact that with the MDGs and the high level of attention being given to poverty in the international agenda, why was it still so persistent? Why weren't we really making significant inroads? And what could we learn from sort of a longer term historical and comparative analysis? And in particular, if we tried to focus not so much on direct interventions that were targeted at poverty, but more at the broader development trajectories and policy regimes, the institutions, the sets of policies in different countries, and the interactions between the economic, social, and political processes, would we, get a more insight into this question of how to reduce poverty? And so I think if I was going to highlight one key message from it, it's that what you see across time, across different countries, is that reduction in poverty generally is not from targeted poverty interventions. It arises when you have this combination of wider social, political, and economic objectives. So they could be things like nation building, social cohesion, redistribution, but employment and inequality are key to poverty reduction. And so, as I say, these elements are all relevant in an interactive way. So I'm going to focus really on the first of 5 key messages that come from the report, but there are strong links particularly, to all of the others, but I'll talk a little bit about inequality and social policy. But the first key message is about the link between growth and patterns of structural change that generate productive employment. And I think if I just step back a bit, the starting point of the report was then a questioning of what was obviously the dominant paradigm and is more questioned now, but is still pretty dominant, of a particular macroeconomic framework for growth and a poverty reduction that was embodied in poverty reduction strategy papers and a much narrower focus on targeting the poor. But also, I think, a relatively technocratic good governance agenda, which ignored a lot of the politics and contestations behind processes of social transformation. And I think these issues are interlinked in the way that employment and the impact of employment translates through into development outcomes. And I think what we're looking at and what we try to elaborate in the report in terms of thinking about structural change is that these are economies, many of these low-income economies are undergoing processes of structural change, whereas the tools of analysis that we're using often to think about labor markets and employment within them are actually marginal, and we're looking at changes in the margin. And so how do we bring back this issue of large-scale changes, of movements of populations, of changing in the structure of the economy back into our thinking about employment creation? I think one of the issues that we see from the historical experience is that the poverty reduction comes, as I've mentioned, not from the targeted policies, but from 2 key aspects. One is the pattern of growth that leads to employment creation, and the second that I want to emphasize as related to that is the successful social policies. And social policies beyond social protection, I'll say more about this, but social policies in the way that we discuss them in the report are, and describe them as transformative, are linked to a productivist agenda. They're also linked to the transformation of the economy, the industrialization process. They are to some extent, and this might vary in different regimes or countries, more or less redistributive, and there has to be some element. but they're also usually premised, and if you look at all the welfare states and the evolution of social policies, for example, in the more successful, economically successful East Asian countries, they're premised on full employment. And I think one of the big challenges for us now in thinking about employment creation and the links between employment and sustainable growth is to think, how do we link, what should be the link between social policies and employment in an environment where the macroeconomic policy context of globalization is not conducive, let's say, to full employment, that we have very high levels of either unemployment or informalization of employment. And I think this is one of the key challenges. It's both a challenge for the more developed welfare states who are faced with maintaining welfare in conditions of less employment, but it's a particular challenge for countries that are trying to develop better forms of social protection, but with very low levels of the kind of formal employment that lends itself to that. So that, I'd say, is one of the main developmental challenges. So how do we explain this missing link that I think Claire was pointing to between the lack of employment creation in the current processes of structural transformation? The critical missing link, I think, and is being argued in the report, has been that either direct employment policies or other policies that can ensure employment creation. And these link to things like strategic industrial policies or the ability to use exchange rate policies, which are obviously more limited in the current macroeconomic framework. But if we look historically, in the world's higher income countries, it was economic growth that fueled the shift in employment and GDP from agriculture to industry, and also then from industry to services. And there's been a pattern of transformation that few lower income countries in recent decades have been able to follow. And the exceptions have largely been in East Asia. And in East Asia, obviously, I think we know that there was a combination of industrial policies, managed trade, close finance and industry links, but also social policies, often not ones that we would recognize explicitly as social policies, but education or other forms of redistribution that raise the skill level of the labor force to facilitate these transformations. But most poor countries are actually not able to follow, lower income countries have not, in the last 20 to 30 years, been able to follow this pattern. And I think what we argue, and just showing a bit of data, I'll go through this quickly, but we can see, as we'd expect, shares of agricultural employment decline with rising per capita income. The share of manufacturing employment actually peaked at around under 40% of the total, but has been, even as incomes are rising in countries, developing countries now, the share of manufacturing in total employment is actually not increasing. It's generally, there's a secular trend towards a lower share. And services, as I think we also realize, are generally increasing. But the thing about services is that they tend to be quite segmented between higher level, higher returns, higher productivity, and a loss of very informal employment linked to poverty. And I think if those figures there, and there's obviously a lot more data in the report, tend to bear out that if you're in informal services as well as agriculture, you have a pretty high probability of being poor. And so the issue then is that, why have these different pathways, why has a pathway towards employment generating structural change not been possible in the current sort of last 20 years, let's say? And one of the main arguments, I'll come back to these pathways, one of the main arguments is the link to global and national level inequality growth. And I think the link, again, one of the things that this report tries to do is put inequality back centrally into the debate about poverty reduction. And what we show is that global and national inequalities are widen, and one of the key factors driving this are intersectoral terms of trade. And this means that poor countries are obviously much more open to the effects of price volatilities or other external events. There are much weaker links between agriculture and industry, as the elites within countries or the sources of demand within countries where you have high inequality can consume things that are produced elsewhere externally. There's very little domestic-driven demand. And obviously there's a close link between domestic demand, the creation of jobs domestically, and the returns to labor in those jobs. So the other issue that we look at to some extent is the shifting functional distribution of income, which has, over the last 2 to 3 decades, shifted massively in favor of capital and away from labor. Just to show the pictures of inequality growing, these are different ways of representing it. The top line is sort of US and Euro area versus other parts of the world per capita growth. And that here you can see, again, I think all these kind of cross-country generalizations about inequality have problems, but from 1981 to the turn of the millennium, you can see a very significant increase in this pattern of inequality. And if you decompose that between inequality, including a global effect, and just looking at a national effect, so the bottom is when the global effect is removed, you can see that a lot of what's driving inequality in low-income countries is this international dimension, global dimension. And so that obviously has implications for how we think about job creation and employment policies and the links with the macroeconomic and more globalization policy agenda. I'll skip that. So just I want to go back briefly to link then the patterns of growth paths and labor markets, but I think also social policy. And most of in the analysis, we group countries by what we see as different sort of forms of welfare regime, and then look at the relationship between growth and things like employment creation. And you can see, the welfare states, the Nordic model, the East Asian developmental welfare states were really premised on a growth model involving full employment, where there was a strong link between the kind of welfare and social policies and the investment in the labor force. What you see obviously in other parts of the world are much higher levels of informality, much more dualist economies and dualist labor markets, or high levels of unemployment. And the other category I think that's interesting to think about in the context now of employment creation will be the mineral rich. A lot of low-income economies now are resource commodity dependent, which has implications for the kind of jobs that can be created. I think that's something that could be, I think, discussed further. But I think just another point on inequality that we obviously know is that inequalities themselves in turn are an obstacle to poverty reduction. So you have a circle, a vicious circle, if you like, of these patterns of growth which are not creating jobs, therefore not generating the resources either for redistribution through welfare mechanisms or through reinvestment in the economy or through creating the domestic market and thus generating growth within the economy. And that obviously, I think what we've seen in the Middle East and North Africa is one of the outcomes of the kind of lack of employment, focus on employment. So the argument about linking social policies, I think very briefly, I realize time is passing quickly. In the report, we talk about social policies in what we call a transformative sense, in that we're not just talking about protection and social protection in terms of a welfarist redistributive policy to support people at the margin. Now, it's not that cash transfers aren't critical and can't have these broader welfare goals, but I think we need to think about social policy in this sense as something that is linked and supportive of the generating the productive capacity of the economy and of individuals, the labor force within that economy. And if you look at from Bismarck, the Nordic models, the East Asian models, that was a critical part of any sort of social policy agenda. But then they obviously have to also be redistributive. And then the other aspect, obviously, of employment in the labor market is that labor is a produced factor input into a production process. It has to be produced itself. And that, at the moment, is largely an unpaid activity undertaken by women in the household. But there's a huge potential there as an employment generating, paid or valued set of activities. And again, that's what you see happening in some, not all, welfare states. And then, of course, there's the protective element. And as I was mentioning before, it's this inseparability. There's the debate now about whether we can separate out employment and social policy, I think is one that will need to keep being debated. But the argument that welfare regimes are sort of more progressive if they, to the extent that they decommodify labor, is to some extent problematic, because you need that full employment or a high level of employment in order to have the welfare regime that can lead to a state of so-called decommodification. So these two things are really, in some fundamental way, inseparable. I'll skip this as we're running out. I think there are lots of ways in which we can talk about the potential for employment creation within the current sort of status quo, if you like, with the macro policy agenda. But I think there are obviously things that we're learning through this crisis responses, that we can have fiscal stimulus policies, there can be better industrial and agricultural policies. There needs to be a more domestic, an agenda which has enough redistribution that ensures returns to labour, that labour's benefit from productivity in order to stimulate and maintain an adequate level of demand. There can be investment in infrastructure and skills which help targeted towards the reproduction of labour and the creation of jobs. I think trade regimes is a broader issue that I'm not qualified really to talk about, but I think there has to be some link between the trade regime in terms of commodity prices and how that feeds through into economies. And above all, targeting employment as a policy goal. I think I could say a lot more about a few other issues here, but just to come to my last concluding thoughts, I think the question that I've raised a couple of times, is it possible to delink work from welfare? I think I'm indicating it's not, and therefore, but we need a different way of thinking about it given the current way in which labour markets are moving towards informalisation and flexible labour markets. That will require a different way of thinking about how the inputs into the production of labour are actually financed. I think we need to think not just at the level of sort of decent work agendas, improving the quality of work, which are all important, but we need to look at these macro frameworks and the links between employment, jobs, and the demand side of the economy. We need to look at the inputs into the production of labour and how it's organised and financed. And I think one of the critical things, there's quite a lot in the report on gender and the service, the care economy. And I think the role of the service sector and the public sector has a huge potential positive impact on where jobs can be created. In more developed countries, the public sector has been a critical force for bringing women into the labour market and for addressing some of these care, service sector, education, etc. areas. And so that seems to be a potential large employment generating sector. The other large generating sector, I think, relates to environmental services and production that's more climate friendly, or the transition to whatever language we use, but this is going to generate potentially jobs, and it's a question of thinking how much they can benefit low-income countries or populations. And I think the final thing I just emphasize is that there is also a link between collective action and the politics of labour organising, which is going to be critical for actually maintaining jobs, ensuring the returns to labour, and ensuring the quality of those jobs. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's really lots to think about there.